A man in a $5,000 suit sat down on my stage, looked my guest dead in the eye, and called him a loser, right to his face, in front of a live audience and a whole lot of cameras. And the only reason he said it, the only crime my guest had committed, was that he didn't have a home to go back to that night. Now here's where I've got to tell you the truth, and the truth is ugly, and I've thought a long time about whether to say it out loud. Because when that man said the word loser, my audience did not gasp. A whole lot of them nodded, quietly, just a little dip of the chin. And I stood there on my own stage and I watched it happen, and my stomach went cold, because that's when I understood what I was really up against. I wasn't fighting one rich man in a nice suit. I was fighting something that a whole lot of people believe way down deep and would never, ever say out loud. And you can't beat that by yelling. You can't shame it out of somebody. All that does is make a man dig his heels in harder. So I didn't argue with him. I want you to hear me. I did not defend my guests, and I did not tear that CEO apart the way everybody expected me to. I told him he was right. I looked at that man and I said, you know what? I think you might have a point. And then I asked him to prove it. And about 2 minutes later, on live television, in front of everybody, that man could not speak. Not a word. Couldn't get one single word out of his mouth. So stay with me, because this one is not the story you think it is. There's no big surprise coming about who my homeless guest secretly was. And that, I promise you, is the whole entire point. And real quick before we get into it, if you have ever been judged in this life for what you didn't have, if anybody ever took one look at your situation and decided they knew what you were worth, tap that subscribe button right now. Do it for every good, decent person out there who got called a loser for the crime of falling on hard times. Now let me tell you what happened. His name was Wendell Carter. Everybody called him Dale. Dale had been homeless for 4 years when he walked onto my stage. And I want to do something right now that nobody in this business ever does. And I want you to notice me doing it because it matters. I am going to tell you right here at the start that there was no secret about Dale. He was not a millionaire who lost it all. He was not some genius in disguise. He didn't have a hidden degree tucked in his pocket. He wasn't a war hero nobody recognized. There was no shocking twist coming about who that man really was underneath. And I know that's what you're expecting, because that's how these stories always go, isn't it? The homeless man turns out to be secretly special, and then everybody feels good and everybody claps. But I'm not going to lie to you like that, because you know what that lie actually says? If you sit with it for a minute, it says the poor man only deserved your respect because it turned out he was secretly somebody important. It says his dignity had to be earned by being exceptional, and that is a lie. And Dale Carter is how I know it. Dale was exactly what he looked like. He was a poor man with nothing. He had worked at a warehouse for 19 years, loading trucks, 19 years. And then his wife, a woman named Ruth, got sick, real sick. And the bills came and they ate the savings, and then they ate the second mortgage, and then the medical leave cost him the warehouse job. And then after all of it, after everything they had was gone, Ruth died anyway. And that's it. That's the whole story. There's no villain in it. There's no big dramatic mistake he made. There's no moment where he threw it all away. A regular man had a bad year, and the bad year had teeth, and it took everything, including her. And 4 years later, he was sleeping in a doorway on Elm Street with a backpack and a folded up sleeping bag. Ordinary, common, happens every single day in this country, boring even. And that is exactly why this story matters. So hold on to it. Now you might be wondering what a man like Dale was even doing on my show. And it's a small thing. It's almost nothing. A few weeks before, a woman had dropped her purse getting into a car right near the spot where Dale slept. Didn't notice. Drove off. And there's a fat wallet in that purse. Cash in it, cards, everything. And Dale picked it up and he sat down right there on that cold sidewalk and he waited. And he waited. 6 hours he sat there in the cold guarding a stranger's purse because he figured she'd come back looking for it, and he wanted to be there when she did. And she did come back. And she about fell over when this homeless man stood up and handed her that purse with every single dollar still in it. And she tried to give him a reward, and he wouldn't take it. Wouldn't take a dime. He just said, "It's yours, ma'am." And he sat back down. That woman wrote to my show. That's how Dale ended up sitting on my stage. That's it. That's the whole segment. A small good thing done by a man who had nothing for no reason at all except that it was right. It was supposed to be a 5-minute feel-good story. In and out. Nice moment. And then Grant Whitlock opened his mouth. Now let me tell you about Grant Whitlock, and I want to be careful here because it would be very easy for me to paint you a picture of a cartoon villain. And that's not who he was. And if I made him one, you learn nothing from him. Grant was a CEO, tech and finance money. And he was on my show that same day for a completely different segment, one about success, because Grant had written a book, a bestseller. He did the whole circuit, keynotes, conferences, the podcast, all of it. And his message was hustle, grit, discipline, no excuses. Your circumstances don't define you, only your choices. And I want to tell you something that's important. Grant was likable. He really was. He was charming and he was articulate, and he had that easy confidence that makes a room lean toward a man. He wasn't foaming at the mouth. He wasn't cruel looking. He was the kind of fella a whole lot of good people follow and admire and quote to their kids. That is exactly what made him dangerous. So we're taping, and my producers, in their wisdom, have these two segments running back to back. And at some point, I do what I always do. I try to make a connection between my guests, and I turn to Grant, and I ask him a question that I regret to this very day, and also thank God for every time I think about it. I said, Grant, you talk about grit and pulling yourself up. Dale here has been through it. What would you say to a man like him? And Grant smiled, that easy, comfortable smile. And he turned in his chair and he looked right at Dale and he said it. He said, honestly, Steve, I say he's a loser. And I don't mean that to be cruel. I mean it factually. Life is a competition and he lost it. I've been broke too. I clawed my way out. He didn't. Anybody in this country can make it if they actually want it badly. And then he shrugged. He just didn't want it badly enough. And the room went quiet. And Dale Carter, sitting 3 feet away from him, didn't say anything back. He didn't fire off some comeback. He didn't get angry. He just looked down at his own hands, folded there in his lap, and he nodded a little, real small. Like a man who has heard it 1,000 times before and long ago stopped expecting different. And I'm telling you, that quiet little nod hurt me worse than anything Grant said. Because that is what 4 years of being called that does to a man. He'd stopped arguing. He'd started agreeing. Now here's where I have to be honest with you again, and this is the hard part. My crowd did not turn on Grant. Some folks did. Don't get me wrong. I heard a few gasps. I saw some heads shaking. But a lot of them, a whole lot of them, sat there and nodded right along with him. Because what Grant said dressed up the way he dressed it up, in that reasonable voice, with that reasonable smile, sounds like common sense to an awful lot of people. Work hard, get ahead. Don't work hard, don't get ahead. Simple. And I stood there on my stage and I felt my whole plan for the next 10 minutes fall apart in my hands. Because I had been about to do what you'd expect me to do. I had been about to come down on that man like the hammer of God, rip him apart, make a scene, get the applause. And I realized right in that second, it would not have worked. Because you cannot argue somebody out of a thing they believe deep down in their gut. It doesn't work. You can't shame it out of them either. All that does is make them dig in and decide you're the bad guy and go home more sure than they were before. If I had yelled at Grant Whitlock, he'd have walked out of that studio a martyr, and half my audience would have gone home still believing every word he said. And Dale Carter would have gone back to that doorway on Elm Street with one more person calling him a loser, and nothing changed at all. I didn't need to win an argument. I needed to change what those people believe. And you don't do that with volume. You do it by showing them something they cannot unsee. So I took a breath, and I did the last thing anybody in that building expected. I agree with him. I turned to Grant, and I put a little smile on, and I said, you know what, Grant? You might be right. And you should have seen his face light up. He was thrilled. He sat back like a man who just won. And I said, let me make sure I understand you, though. You're saying success comes down to grit, discipline, doing the hard thing every single day when nobody's watching and nobody's clapping. That's the real measure of a man. Have I got that right? And he said, that's exactly right, Steve. That's the whole thesis of the book. And I said, good. Then let's not sit here arguing about it. Let's measure it. He said, measure it? And I said, yes, sir. Not with speeches, not with books. Let's measure it with a Tuesday. Dale's Tuesday. You up for that? And that man, God bless him, that man said yes, because he thought he was about to win the biggest argument of his career on national television. He leaned forward in his chair, eager as could be. He walked into it with his whole chest. And that is how a trap made out of nothing but the truth works. You don't have to push anybody into it. They climb in themselves because it's built out of the very thing they believe. So I brought up the numbers, real ones. Dale's real ones from his real life, which my team had gone through with him beforehand for the segment and which I had been planning to skip right past. I said, all right, Grant, here we go. Your deal. You wake up this morning on the sidewalk. You have $11 to your name. 11. Now, you're a smart man. You're a CEO. You got all that grit. Show me. Get yourself out. Take all the time you need. And he laughed a little and he said, okay, easy. First thing, I get a job. And I said, beautiful. Where? He said, anywhere. Fast food. Warehouse. Doesn't matter. I'm not too proud. And I said, all right. They're going to need to see your ID. And he said, fine. I showed him my ID. And I said, you don't have one, Grant. It got stolen out of Dale's backpack in year 2, along with his birth certificate. So let's go get you a new one. He said, okay. So I go get a new one. And I said, it costs money and you need a document proving where you live. And he stopped just for a second. And he said, well, I'd use the shelter's address. And I said, that's smart. That's real smart. And a lot of shelters will let you. But the one in Dale's area won't, because they had a fraud problem 2 years back and they stopped. And even if they would, the shelter's got 40 beds and 110 people in line every night. And if you're not in that line by 3 in the afternoon, you don't get one. And if you're standing in that line at 3 in the afternoon, Grant, then tell me something. And I looked at him. How are you at work? And the room got very, very quiet because there it is. That's the loop. You need an address to get an ID. You need an ID to get the job. You need the job to get the address. And every single door in that circle is locked. And every key is behind one of the other doors. And I watched a very smart man walk around and around that circle in front of a live studio audience, trying every single road, and every time he found one, I closed it. Not with an opinion, with a fact, real ones from Dale's real life. He said, then I take the bus across town where they're hiring. And I said, bus fare is $2.75 each way. That's $5.50 out of your $11. And now you can't eat. And the interview is at 9 in the morning and the shelter kicks you out at 6 and you got nowhere to wash up. So you're going to walk into that interview in the same clothes you slept in on the sidewalk. How'd you do in that interview, Grant? And he started to say something and stopped. He tried again. He said, then I'd find a program. There are programs. And I said, there's a good one. Dale's in it. It's 9 miles from where he sleeps. What's your plan to get there every day? And he said, and then he stopped himself because he already knew what the bus cost and he knew how many dollars he had left. And then he did the thing that everybody does sooner or later when they hit the wall of that loop. He started saying the magic words. He said, well, he could just, and I let him get about halfway through it. And then I said gently, real gentle, he tried that, Grant. Here's what happened. And I did it again and again. I answered with what actually happened when Dale actually tried it. Because Dale had tried them all, every last one, 4 years of trying them all. And the sweat came out on that man's forehead. And his voice got quieter. And the confident CEO who had written a best-selling book about how anybody can make it if they want it badly enough, sat on my stage and could not get himself out, on paper, with a pencil, in a warm studio, with a chair to sit in, and a full stomach, and no cold, and no exhaustion, and no grief, and everybody being polite to him. He could not do it. And I hadn't raised my voice one single time, but I wasn't done because the math was only half of it. And the second half is the part that broke that room wide open. I said, Grant, let's set the money aside. You wrote a whole book about discipline, about doing the hard thing every day when nobody's watching. That's your word, right? Discipline? And he nodded, quiet now. And I said, that training program I mentioned, the one 9 miles from where Dale sleeps, Dale has been going to it for 4 years. Every single day it's open. And Grant said, how does he get there? And I said, he walks. I let that sit for a second. I said, 9 miles there, 9 miles back, 18 miles a day for 4 years. In the summer, in the rain, in January. All feet that have been in the same pair of boots for 2 years. He gets up before the sun because he has to leave that early to make it. And he walks 18 miles. And then he sleeps on the ground. And then he gets up and he does it again. And then I looked at that CEO and I asked him the question, and I asked it as kindly as I know how. I said, Grant, you wrote the book on discipline. How many miles did you walk today? And that man opened his mouth and nothing came out, nothing. He sat there in his $5,000 suit with his best-selling book about grit in front of that whole silent studio, and he could not answer me. He looked at Dale and he looked at his own hands, and you could see something coming apart behind that man's eyes. But I had one more question, and this was the one that finished it. And I want you to understand, I did not ask it to be cruel. I asked it because it was true and because that whole room needed to hear the answer. I said, Greg, you said something earlier. You said you've been broke too and you clawed your way out. Now I believe you. I do. But I want you to do one thing for me. I want you to name the people who helped you. Just one. Give me one name. And here's the thing about a man like that. He answered without even thinking because he'd never once been asked and it had never once occurred to him that it mattered. He just started listing them right there like it was nothing. He said, well, my uncle floated me alone when I was starting out. And my college roommate got me the interview that started everything. And this is the one. And I lived in my parents' basement rent-free for about a year while I got the company off the ground. And then he stopped because he heard himself. You could see the exact second he heard himself. Alone, a connection, a roof. Three things. Three things Dale Carter did not have, has never had, and will never have. A man that just stood in front of the world and said, nobody helped me. I did it all alone. And then, when asked one simple question, listed three people who caught him before he ever hit the ground. He had a net the whole time. He just never looked down. And he had never, not once in his life, called any of that a handout. And that right there is what left him speechless. Not me yelling, not some clever insult, not a mic drop. A man discovering, live, on television, in front of everybody, that the story he built his entire identity on, the story he sold in a best-selling book, the story he used to look down on a man sleeping in a doorway was something he had made up about himself. And he believed it. He believed it the hardest of anybody. Now here's the part I care about most in this whole story. Because this is why I did it the way I did it, instead of the way you all wanted me to. My audience changed. I watched it happen. Those same folks who nodded along at the beginning, the ones who agreed with him quietly, the ones who've been sitting there thinking, well, he's not wrong. I watched their faces come apart. I watched people put their hands over their mouths. I watched grown men in that audience wipe their eyes because they hadn't been argued. They hadn't been yelled at or called names or told they were bad people. They'd been shown something plain as day with real numbers and real facts. And once you see a thing like that, you cannot unsee it. You can walk out of an argument. You cannot walk out of the truth. If I had screamed at Greg Whitlock, I'd have gotten my applause and I'd have changed exactly nobody. Instead, I gave that man enough rope to walk himself all the way around a circle he'd never once had to walk before. And by the time he came out the other side, he'd taken my whole audience with him. But we're not done. Because there was one more thing about Dale Carter that I did not know. Not a secret about his past. I told you at the start, there was never anything hidden about that man's past. This was about his present, about what he was doing right then with the nothing he had. I asked him in front of everybody the question that had been sitting in me the whole time. I said, Dale, that bus is $275. Some days, I know for a fact you've had $275. Why do you walk? And Dale Carter, who had not said a word this entire time, who had sat there quiet and small while the rich man called him a loser, looked up at me and he said, because I'm saving it. And I said, saving it for what, Dale? And he said, for Ruth's bills. And the room went so quiet, I could hear the lights humming. He said his wife's medical debt was still out there, thousands and thousands of dollars up, and nobody was chasing him for it. Nobody could. He had nothing to take. Any lawyer alive would have told him to walk away from it, and it would have vanished into a write-off column at some hospital, and no human being would ever have thought about it again. And Dale Carter had decided 4 years ago that he was going to pay it. Every day he saves the bus fare, $2.75 twice, and every so often, when it adds up to something, he sends it in. $5, $11, whatever he's got. And I said, Dale, that'll take you the rest of your life. And he said, yeah, probably will. And I said, then why? And that man looked me right in the eye, this homeless man that a millionaire had just called a loser on national television. And he said, because it's got her name on it, Ruth's name. And I'm not gonna let the last thing in this world with my wife's name on it be a bill somebody threw in the garbage. She was worth paying for. 18 miles a day, 4 years. Rain, snow, January, blisters, all of it. So a woman who has been dead for 4 years would not have her name attached to a debt somebody wrote off as trash. You tell me. You look me in the eye and you tell me which one of those two men on my stage had grit. One of them wrote a book about discipline and sold 1 million copies and lived rent-free in his mama's basement while he did it. The other one lived it. 18 miles a day for 4 years. For a woman who wasn't even alive to see him do it. And he never told a living soul. And he never asked anybody for a thing. and we call him the loser. Now let me tell you how it ended, and I'm going to tell you the truth, not the fairy tale. Grant Whitlock did not get destroyed, not by me and not by the crowd. There was no big scene. He just went very, very quiet. And then he did the one honest thing I've ever seen a man like that do. He looked at Dale and his voice cracked and he said out loud on the air, "I've been lying. Not to you." And he stopped. And then he said, "To myself." That's all. He didn't become a saint. He didn't get down on his knees. A man does not undo 40 years of a story he told himself in 10 minutes on a game show. And if I told you he did, you'd know I was lying to you. All that happened was a crack. One little crack in a wall he spent his whole life building. But a crack is where the light gets in. And Dale? Dale did not get a magic check. And I want to explain to you why not. Because this matters more than anything else I've said. Dale Carter never had a grit problem. Not one day in his life. That man had more discipline in his left boot than most of us have in our whole bodies. What Dale had was a locked door. He was standing in that loop, and every key was on the other side of a door he couldn't open. He didn't need somebody to hand him a fortune. He needed somebody to unlock one door. So that's what we did. We got that man an address, a real one, because it turns out an address is the single most powerful thing in this country, and nobody who has one ever thinks about it. And with an address, he got an ID. And with an ID, in 4 years of training he'd already walked 18 miles a day to earn, he got a job. Not a charity job. A real one that he was qualified for, that he'd been qualified for the whole entire time. He was always ready. The door was just locked. And that is the honest ending, and I think it's better than a check, because a check says we saved him. And the truth says he'd been saving himself for 4 years, and this world just wouldn't let him. About a month later, Ruth's medical debt got paid off. All of it. Every penny. Not by me. It came in anonymously. No name on it. And I have my suspicions, and so do you. And I've never once tried to confirm it, because I don't think that's the point. But here's the part nobody expects. When Dale found out, he wasn't happy. He was angry, because he had wanted to finish it himself. 4 years he'd been walking for that. 18 miles a day. And somebody with money had reached in and taken the last thing he had that was his to give her. And it took him a long while to make peace with it. And when he finally did, he told me something I'll never forget. He said, "I figured out I wasn't walking those miles for the money, Steve. The money was never going to be enough anyway. I was walking them for her, and I can keep doing that. Don't need a bill to do that." So let me leave you with this. We've got this whole thing backwards, all of us. Every day, we look at a man who has nothing, and the question we ask is, what's wrong with him? And then we look at a man who has everything, and the question we ask is, what's his secret? I don't ask either one of those anymore, not since that day. Now, I only ask one thing about a person, and it's this. What are you doing with what you've got? Because Grant Whitlock had everything a man could ask for, and he did the easy thing, and he told himself it was hard. And Dale Carter had absolutely nothing, and he walked 18 miles a day for a dead woman's name. And this whole world looked at those two men and called one of them a winner and one of them a loser. And this world had it exactly, completely backward. So the next time you walk past somebody who's got nothing, do me a favor. Don't feel sorry for them. That's not what they need, and it isn't worth much anyway. Just don't you dare assume you know what's inside them, because you have no idea what that person is carrying or how far they walked today or who they're walking for. If this one hit you tonight, do 3 things for me before you go. Subscribe to this channel, because we tell the stories that make you look at people all over again. Share this with one person who needs to hear it. And go down to those comments and type the words 18 miles for Dale and for Ruth and for every quiet soul out there walking further than anybody knows. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next one. God bless you, and God bless every person out there who's got nothing left but their word and is keeping it anyway.